AD 272. The Roman Empire was dying, split into three warring pieces, barbarians pouring across every border, 20 emperors murdered in 50 years. Then a blacksmith's son named Aurelian seized the purple and did the impossible. He decided to put Rome back together with nothing but raw violence and 15,000 exhausted legionaries. Standing in his way at Immae was Zenobia, the warrior queen who'd carved out an eastern empire stretching from Egypt to Turkey, commanding 40,000 soldiers, including the most feared cavalry in the known world. By sunset, her army would be shattered, her empire doomed, and Aurelian would earn a title that still echoes: Restorer of the World. Think about what Aurelian faced. Outnumbered nearly 3-1, fighting the best heavy cavalry Rome had ever seen. Armored horsemen who'd crushed every army they'd faced for a decade. His soldiers were veterans of 20 civil wars, exhausted, skeptical, wondering why they should die to reconquer an empire that had already collapsed. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Aurelian pulled off one of history's most brilliant tactical deceptions. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter everything you thought you knew about Roman warfare. First, the fake retreat that turned certain death into total victory. Second, the 90-minute cavalry charge that became a death trap. And third, why Zenobia's invincible cataphracts never even reached Roman lines. But here's what makes this truly insane. How did Aurelian convince exhausted legionaries to run away from battle as part of the plan? What did Zenobia's generals see that made him order a pursuit that destroyed his own army? Why did the heaviest cavalry in the ancient world collapse from exhaustion before striking a single blow? And how did 15,000 Romans kill 3 times their number in one afternoon without ever breaking formation? To understand how Aurelian saved Rome through deception and discipline, we need to go back to the moment when the empire was 3 days from ceasing to exist. 82 and 68. Rome wasn't dying, it was already dead, and nobody had bothered to bury the corpse. In 50 years, the empire had burned through 26 emperors, most lasting less than 3 years before being murdered by their own soldiers, poisoned by senators, or cut down in civil wars that consumed entire provinces. The frontiers were collapsing. Germanic tribes poured across the Rhine and Danube like floodwaters, burning cities that had stood for centuries. Persia had captured a Roman emperor, Valerian, and used him as a footstool before flaying him alive and stuffing his skin with straw. The legions that had once conquered the known world were now fighting each other over scraps of imperial authority while the provinces burned. And then, in the chaos, 3 men simultaneously declared themselves emperor and carved the dying empire into pieces. Postumus seized Gaul, Britain, and Spain, creating the Gallic Empire. Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, took Egypt, Syria, and most of Asia Minor, proclaiming her son emperor of the East. And in the middle, desperately holding Italy and the Balkans, stood Claudius Gothicus, who would die of plague within 2 years, leaving Rome's corpse to a soldier nobody had ever heard of, a man who'd been born in a blacksmith's shop and had spent 30 years killing Rome's enemies without ever asking why. The mathematics of collapse were staggering and simple. In 235 AD, Rome controlled 2.5 million square miles and 70 million people. By 268 AD, the empire had effectively fractured into 3 separate states, each claiming legitimacy, none capable of defeating the others. The Gallic Empire held everything west of the Alps: Gaul, Britain, and Hispania, approximately 40% of Rome's former territory and tax base. Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire controlled the east: Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and the trade routes that made the Mediterranean world wealthy, another 25% of imperial territory. That left Claudius Gothicus holding Italy, the Balkans, and North Africa. desperately fighting wars on 6 simultaneous fronts while watching his empire's richest provinces slip away. Think about that fragmentation. Rome had spent 500 years building the largest empire the Western world had ever seen, and it took just 33 years to shatter completely. Here's what the official chronicles don't tell you about the 3rd century crisis. It wasn't just political instability, it was civilizational collapse in real time. The currency had been debased so thoroughly that a denarius coin in 268 AD contained 0.5% silver, compared to 95% silver in 200 AD. Inflation was so catastrophic that soldiers refused payment in coins and demanded goods instead. Cities that had flourished for centuries were being abandoned as populations fled to fortified hilltops. The road system, Rome's communication and military backbone, was crumbling because nobody could afford maintenance. Literacy rates were dropping. Trade networks were collapsing. The Pax Romana, which had guaranteed 200 years of relative peace and prosperity, was replaced by endemic warfare where armies fought each other instead of defending borders. The military situation was even worse than the economic disaster. Rome's theoretical military strength in 268 AD stood at approximately 400,000 soldiers across all legions and auxiliary units. But those forces were scattered across a 10,000-mile frontier, fighting enemies simultaneously in Britain, Germania, Pannonia, Thrace, Syria, and North Africa. The legions themselves had deteriorated from the disciplined professional armies that conquered Gaul and Judea. Equipment was substandard because nobody could afford quality gear. Training had collapsed because units were constantly mobilized for civil wars instead of drilling. Desertion rates hit 30% in some legions. Soldiers who'd enlisted to defend Rome were now being asked to fight other Romans over which general got to wear purple, and they were understandably skeptical about dying for yet another emperor who'd be murdered within 3 years. But here's where the situation became genuinely insane. The external enemies weren't waiting for Rome to figure itself out. They were taking advantage of Roman weakness to carve off chunks of territory. The Goths had crossed the Danube in force, sacking cities in Thrace and Greece. The Alemanni had penetrated all the way to northern Italy in 268 before Claudius Gothicus barely defeated them. The Sassanid Persians were raiding across the Euphrates, burning Roman cities that had stood for 300 years. Every frontier was simultaneously collapsing, and Rome had no strategic reserves because every available soldier was committed to fighting civil wars or desperately plugging holes in the border. And riding through this apocalypse, watching the empire die in real time, was a 53-year-old cavalry commander named Aurelian, who'd spent his entire adult life in the legions and had seen Rome's collapse from the ground level. He'd fought the Goths in Moesia. He'd campaigned against Persia. He'd crushed 3 separate usurpers who'd tried to carve off pieces of the empire for themselves. He was a soldier's soldier. Brutal, competent, utterly lacking in political sophistication. And he was about to do something that everyone thought was impossible. When Claudius Gothicus died of plague in September 270, leaving the empire to whoever the army would follow, Aurelian would take the purple and make a promise that should have been delusional. He would restore Rome, all of it, or die trying. The soldiers laughed. The Senate thought he was insane. Zenobia, ruling her eastern empire from Palmyra, didn't even consider him a serious threat. Within 2 years, Aurelian would prove everyone wrong through sheer violence and tactical brilliance. But first, he needed to survive long enough to reach the battlefield where he'd announced that Rome's collapse was being canceled. And that battlefield was waiting in Syria, at a place called Immae, where 15,000 exhausted Romans would face 40,000 of the finest cavalry in the ancient world. September 270th. Claudius Gothicus was dead from plague, and the empire's senior commanders gathered in Sirmium to choose his successor. not through Senate vote or hereditary right, but through the ancient Roman method of seeing who the soldiers would actually follow. They chose Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, known to his men simply as Aurelian, a 55-year-old career soldier who'd spent 3 decades in the legions and never held political office. He was the son of a colonist, a tenant farmer bound to work another man's land, and had joined the army as a common cavalryman because it was either that or starve. He'd risen through ranks by being better at killing than anyone else, commanding cavalry against the Goths, fighting Persians, crushing 3 separate usurpers who tried to seize power during the previous emperor's reign. His soldiers called him Hand on Hilt because he never drew his sword unless he intended to use it. And when he did draw it, somebody died. The Senate feared him. The Praetorian Guard hated him. His own officers thought he was insane. But the legionaries who'd fought under him would follow him into the underworld if he asked, because Aurelian had one quality that Rome desperately needed. He won. And when he took the purple in September 270, he made a promise that should have been impossible. He would restore the empire, all of it, or die trying. The circumstances of Aurelian's rise were as brutal as the man himself. Claudius Gothicus had died at Sirmium on August 25th, leaving no clear successor and an empire that was actively disintegrating. Within hours, senior commanders were positioning their legions for civil war because that's how succession worked in 270 AD. Whoever could command the most loyalty seized power, and everyone else either bent the knee or died. But Aurelian already had the cavalry's absolute devotion, and cavalry commanders in the 3rd century held veto power over any succession dispute. On September 9th, the army assembled in the Forum at Sirmium and acclaimed Aurelian emperor by vote. Not a Senate debate, not a political negotiation, just 30,000 soldiers shouting his name until the officers accepted reality. Think about that. A tenant farmer's son, a man with no aristocratic lineage, no political connections, no legal claim to power beyond being exceptionally good at warfare, became emperor of Rome through pure military competence. The Senate in Rome wasn't consulted. They were informed. Here's what the official histories don't tell you about Aurelian's first weeks in power. He nearly lost the empire before he even secured it. The moment news spread that Claudius was dead and Aurelian had seized power, 3 separate revolts erupted simultaneously. In Pannonia, a commander named Septimius declared himself emperor and mobilized 2 legions. In northern Italy, a senator named Felicissimus, controller of the mint and one of Rome's wealthiest men, led a revolt of mint workers who'd been debasing the currency and didn't want Aurelian's reforms cutting off their profits. And on the Danube frontier, Gothic raiders saw the succession crisis as an opportunity and launched massive raids into Roman territory. Aurelian was emperor of an empire that didn't exist yet, and he had maybe 3 months before it fragmented completely. His response revealed exactly why the soldiers had chosen him. Aurelian didn't negotiate, didn't compromise, didn't send diplomatic envoys to reason with rebels. He mobilized the mobile field army, approximately 15,000 cavalry and infantry, and marched. Septimius in Pannonia was crushed in a single battle that lasted 90 minutes. His 2 legions destroyed, the survivors decimated as punishment for following a usurper. Aurelian executed Septimius personally, then sent his head to Rome as a message. Total time from revolt to resolution, 3 weeks. Felicissimus and his mint workers revolted in Rome itself, barricading the Caelian hill with 7,000 armed men thinking the Senate would protect them. Aurelian arrived with his cavalry, stormed the barricades, and killed everyone. Not just the rebels, but their families, their associates, anyone connected to the conspiracy. Roman sources claim 7,000 died on the Kilian Hill in a single day. Let that number sink in. Aurelian killed more Romans in one afternoon of urban warfare than died at most battles. The message was clear. Rebellion ended in mass graves. No exceptions, no mercy. But here's where Aurelian's genius became apparent. While other emperors would have spent years consolidating power, paranoid about internal threats, Aurelian understood that the empire's real crisis was external. Rome was fractured into 3 pieces, each controlled by a rival power that was building legitimacy daily. The longer he waited, the more permanent those fractures became. So 30 days after becoming emperor, before the Senate had even formally recognized him, before half the provinces knew Claudius was dead, Aurelian announced his strategy. He would reconquer the Roman Empire in the order of strategic priority. First, crush the Goths raiding the Danube frontier, because losing the Balkans meant losing Italy. Second, march east and destroy Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire, because Egypt's grain fed Rome, and losing it meant famine and revolt. Third, invade Gaul and force the Gallic Empire back into submission. 3 campaigns, 3 years. Complete restoration of imperial authority, or death trying. His officers thought it was suicide. The Senate sent delegations begging him to negotiate instead of fight. Even his closest advisors suggested he secure Italy first, then worry about the provinces later. Aurelian's response, preserved in contemporary sources, was characteristically blunt. Rome does not negotiate with rebels. Rome crushes them, and I am Rome. Within 6 months, he defeated the Goths in 2 major battles, stabilizing the Danube frontier through raw violence and tactical superiority. By spring 271, he'd secured the Balkans. And in early 272, he turned his attention east toward Zenobia, the warrior queen who'd carved out an empire while Rome burned, and who now controlled half the Mediterranean's wealth. The collision between Aurelian and Zenobia was inevitable. 2 leaders who'd risen through warfare, both absolutely convinced they could remake the world through military force, neither capable of backing down. When Aurelian demanded Zenobia submit to Roman authority, she sent back a message that still survives in fragments. She acknowledged no emperor but her son, and if Aurelian wanted her empire, he'd have to take it with blood. Aurelian read her response, handed it to an aide to burn, and gave the order that would lead to Immae. Mobilize the Eastern Field Army, march to Syria, and show the Queen of Palmyra what happens when Rome decides you've stolen too much. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Rome could still enforce its will through superior tactics, or whether the age of Roman dominance was permanently finished. While Rome tore itself apart, Zenobia had done something no Roman woman had ever achieved. She'd conquered an empire. Born around 240 AD in Palmyra, a wealthy trading city in the Syrian desert, she'd married Odenathus, the Roman-appointed governor who'd saved the East by defeating Persia when Rome couldn't. When Odenathus was murdered in 267, possibly by Zenobia herself, though sources disagree, she became regent for her young son Vabalithus, and immediately proved she was more dangerous than her husband ever was. Within 3 years, she'd invaded Egypt, seized Anatolia, and controlled everything from the Euphrates to the Bosphorus. Her army numbered 70,000, mostly Arab light cavalry and Syrian infantry, but also including the Palmyrene cataphracts, the heaviest cavalry Rome had ever faced. These were horsemen in full armor, scale mail covering them from head to toe, their horses armored with iron plates, carrying 12-foot lances that could punch through shields and men together. They'd shattered every Roman force sent against them, and Zenobia had a general named Zabdas who understood exactly how to use them. By 271, She controlled Rome's richest provinces, the grain supply from Egypt, and the trade routes that made the empire wealthy. She wasn't just a rebel. She was building a rival empire, and she had the military strength to make it permanent. When Aurelian demanded she submit to Rome, she sent back a message that still survives in fragments. She recognized no emperor but her son, and if Aurelian wanted her provinces, he would have to take them with steel. The speed of Zenobia's conquest defied Roman comprehension. In September 270, the exact month Aurelian became emperor, Zenobia's armies invaded Egypt with 25,000 troops under General Zabdas and conquered the entire province in 8 weeks. Think about that timeline. Egypt had been Rome's most valuable possession for 300 years, the breadbasket that fed Italy, the source of grain that kept the Roman mob docile. Zenobia took it in 2 months. By November 270, Palmyrene garrisons controlled Alexandria, Memphis, and every major city along the Nile. Roman officials who resisted were executed. Those who submitted were kept in their positions, administering Egyptian tax collection on behalf of Palmyra instead of Rome. Zenobia had just cut off Rome's grain supply, and Aurelian couldn't respond because he was busy crushing Gothic invasions on the Danube. Here's what the Roman chronicles don't tell you about Zenobia's military genius. She wasn't just conquering territory. She was building legitimacy faster than Rome could respond. In every city she captured, she minted coins showing her son Vabalithus alongside Aurelian, implying co-emperorship rather than rebellion. It was brilliant propaganda. To the local populations, she wasn't a rebel queen. She was a legitimate Roman ruler restoring order to provinces Rome had abandoned. Her coins circulated in markets from Ankara to Alexandria, each one a statement that Palmyra was the new power in the east. By 271, she'd stopped minting coins with Aurelian's image entirely. Now her coinage showed only Vabalithus, with the title Augustus, Emperor. She'd gone from regent to rebel to rival emperor in 18 months, and Rome had been too distracted by civil wars to stop her. The military force backing Zenobia's empire was unlike anything Rome had fielded in generations. Her 70,000-strong army was organized around 3 core elements. First, 4,000 Palmyrene cataphracts, the armored shock cavalry that could break infantry formations through sheer momentum and terror. Each cataphract cost more to equip than 20 regular cavalry, their armor requiring skilled smiths and months of work. But the investment was worth it, because cataphracts had never lost a major battle against Roman forces. Second, 25,000 light cavalry. Mostly Arab tribal warriors armed with javelins and bows, masters of desert warfare who could ride circles around Roman cavalry. Third, 30,000 infantry, Syrian, Egyptian, and Anatolian troops, well-trained and battle-tested from 5 years of continuous campaigning. The remaining 11,000 were support troops, engineers, and garrison forces. Total military expenditure, approximately 15 million denarii annually, funded by taxing the richest provinces in the Roman world. But here's where Zenobia's position became genuinely formidable. She wasn't just militarily strong. She was economically self-sufficient in ways Rome no longer was. Palmyra controlled the Silk Road trade routes connecting Rome to Persia, India, and China. Luxury goods, silk, spices, gems, flowed through Palmyrene customs houses, generating enormous revenue. Egypt's grain harvest, normally sent to Rome, now fed Zenobia's army and cities. Anatolian mines produced silver, copper, and iron for weapons and coinage. She'd captured the economic engine of the Eastern Mediterranean and was using it to fund a military that could defend her conquests indefinitely. Think about the strategic nightmare this created for Aurelian. He couldn't simply starve Zenobia out. She controlled more agricultural land than he did. He couldn't outspend her. Her treasury was wealthier. He had to defeat her militarily on ground she'd chosen, against forces that outnumbered his field army 4-1. Zenobia herself was no figurehead. Contemporary sources, both Roman and Palmyrene, describe her personally commanding troops, riding with her army, and participating in war councils with her generals. She spoke multiple languages: Palmyrene Aramaic, Greek, Egyptian, and reportedly some Latin. She had studied military history, reading Plutarch's accounts of Alexander and Caesar's Gallic campaigns. When Roman ambassadors arrived in Palmyra demanding submission, she received them dressed in purple, the color reserved for emperors, and informed them that Palmyra would negotiate with Rome as equals, not subjects. One ambassador reportedly asked if she understood the consequences of defying Rome. Zenobia's response, preserved by the historian Zosimus: "Rome has 26 dead emperors in 50 years. I have been queen for 5 years, and my empire grows stronger daily. Perhaps Rome should submit to me." The collision between Aurelian and Zenobia was now inevitable and existential. If Aurelian lost, Rome permanently lost the East, became a rump Italian kingdom surviving on scraps, and ceased to be an empire in any meaningful sense. If Zenobia lost, her empire collapsed, her army dissolved, and she'd be paraded through Rome in chains before being executed as a traitor, the traditional fate of defeated rebels. Neither could back down, neither would compromise. And by winter 272, both knew the confrontation was weeks away. Aurelian was marching east with 15,000 legionaries, the largest force he could assemble without leaving Italy defenseless. Zenobia was concentrating her armies in Syria, preparing to meet him on ground where her cataphracts could demonstrate why Roman infantry tactics were obsolete. The question wasn't whether they'd fight. It was whether Aurelian had any tactical answer to cavalry that had never been defeated. The answer would come at Immae, where a blacksmith's son and a warrior queen would bet everything on one afternoon's violence. Spring 272. Aurelian assembled his invasion force in Byzantium, 15,000 men, which was everything Rome could spare after fighting Goths, Vandals, and internal revolts for 3 straight years. Think about that number. 15,000 soldiers to reconquer an empire that stretched from Egypt to Turkey, defended by 70,000 troops who'd been winning for 5 years straight. His officers told him it was suicide. His logistics officers calculated the army would starve before reaching Antioch. The Senate sent letters suggesting diplomacy, negotiation, anything except war. Aurelian ignored them all. He marched south through Anatolia in forced marches that covered 30 miles per day, an insane pace that destroyed men's feet and killed dozens of horses daily, but got the Romans to Syria before Zenobia could fully mobilize her forces. The march itself became legendary. Roman discipline, which had collapsed during the decades of civil war, was restored through brutal enforcement. Soldiers who fell behind were left behind. Units that broke march order were decimated, 1 man in 10 beaten to death by his comrades as punishment. Aurelian was rebuilding the Roman military through raw terror. And it worked because his men believed in one thing: if they followed this maniac, they might actually win. By late March, his army emerged from the Cilician gates into the Syrian plain, exhausted, hungry, and staring at an enemy force nearly 3 times their size. The logistics of Aurelian's march defied every principle of Roman military planning. A standard legion on campaign moved 15 to 18 miles per day, with 1 rest day per week, arriving at battlefields fresh enough to fight. Aurelian's forced marches covered 30 miles daily, sometimes 35 on good roads, with no rest days for 3 consecutive weeks. the human cost was immediate and brutal. Within the first week, approximately 800 soldiers had collapsed from exhaustion, heat stroke, or foot injuries so severe they couldn't continue. Aurelian's orders were explicit. No wagons for stragglers, no medical evacuation, no slowing the column. Men who couldn't keep pace were left with a day's rations and directions to the nearest Roman garrison. If they made it, they lived. If they didn't, they died. By the time the army reached Diana in central Anatolia, roughly 1,200 men had been lost to the march itself, 8% casualties without even reaching the enemy. Here's what the sources don't tell you about why Aurelian accepted such catastrophic attrition. He was racing against time and intelligence. Palmyrene scouts had reported Roman mobilization to Zenobia by mid-February. Standard Roman campaign timing would put Aurelian's army in Syria by late May, giving Zenobia 3 months to concentrate forces, prepare defensive positions, and potentially receive reinforcements from Egypt. But Aurelian understood that Zenobia's 70,000-strong army was dispersed. Garrisons in Egypt, Anatolia, and Syria couldn't all reach Antioch simultaneously. If he arrived in March instead of May, he'd face maybe 40,000 Palmyrenes instead of the full force. Those 2 months were worth losing 1 in 200 men on the march, because fighting 40,000 enemies was survivable, while fighting 70,000 was suicide. The army's composition reflected Aurelian's tactical priorities and Rome's desperate circumstances. Of his 15,000 soldiers, approximately 3,000 were heavy cavalry, mostly Dalmatian and Moorish riders who'd fought under Aurelian for years and trusted him absolutely. Another 2,000 were light cavalry, scouts, skirmishers, and horse archers recruited from Rome's eastern provinces. The remaining 10,000 were legionary infantry, heavy infantry with shields, Pila, and gladi, organized into units that had been fighting continuously since 268 and knew how to function under pressure. Think about that ratio. 1/3 cavalry, 2/3 infantry. Aurelian was building a mobile force designed to maneuver against Zenobia's cavalry-heavy army, rather than simply anchor in defensive positions and hope to survive. It was a radical departure from traditional Roman military doctrine, which emphasized infantry dominance. But Aurelian had spent 30 years watching traditional tactics fail against mobile cavalry forces. Supply logistics were even more audacious and insane. Standard campaign planning required extensive supply, trains, wagons carrying grain, salted meat, weapons, replacement equipment, medical supplies, and fodder for animals. Aurelian's supply train was stripped to absolute minimum. 10 days of food, basic medical supplies, and ammunition for archers. Everything else was abandoned or carried by the soldiers themselves. His logistics officer, a career quartermaster named Mukapor, protested that the army would starve within 2 weeks. Aurelian's response was characteristically brutal. "We'll eat what we capture from Palmyrene supply depots, and if there aren't enough depots, we'll eat faster and fight sooner." It was supply doctrine that assumed victory, because defeat meant the army starved to death in hostile territory with no supply line back to Byzantium. But here's where Aurelian's genius became apparent. He wasn't just marching his army into Syria, he was conditioning them psychologically for the battle ahead. Every day of brutal forced marches, every night of short rations, every punishment for broken discipline was teaching his soldiers one lesson. Under Aurelian, you survive by being harder than your enemy, not by being comfortable. The men who emerged from the Cilician gates in late March were exhausted, hungry, and had watched 1,200 comrades fall to attrition. But they were also the toughest 13,800 soldiers in the Roman world, men who'd proven they could endure anything, and who'd developed absolute trust that Aurelian's insane decisions somehow kept them alive. when they saw Palmyrene scouts on the horizon, reporting their position to Zenobia's commanders. Not a single Roman soldier suggested retreat. March 28, 272. Aurelian's vanguard cavalry reached the outskirts of Antioch and captured Palmyrene scouts who confirmed what Roman intelligence already suspected. Zenobia had assembled approximately 40,000 troops near a valley called Immae, 20 miles north of the city. Her general Zabdas had chosen the ground, perfect cavalry terrain where his cataphracts could demonstrate their superiority. Aurelian received this report, studied rough maps his scouts had drawn, and smiled for the first time in 3 weeks. Zabdas had done exactly what Aurelian hoped. Positioned his army on open ground where maneuver would decide the battle, not fortifications or siegecraft. The Palmyrene general thought he'd chosen terrain that guaranteed victory. What he'd actually done was create the perfect battlefield for Aurelian to demonstrate that superior tactics could beat superior numbers. Within 48 hours, both armies would be deployed at Immae, staring at each other across a valley that would become the graveyard of the Palmyrene Empire. March 277. Immae was a valley 20 miles north of Antioch, flanked by low hills with the Orontes River running to the west, perfect cavalry country, which is exactly why Zenobia's general Zabdas chose it. The plain was wide, flat, and dry, giving his cataphracts room to build momentum for devastating charges. The hills on either side were gentle slopes that wouldn't break up cavalry formations. There were no forests, no marshes, no defensive terrain where Roman infantry could anchor their lines. This was ground where heavy cavalry dominated, and Zabdas had the finest heavy cavalry in the world. 4,000 Palmyrene cataphracts, fully armored horsemen on armored horses, plus 16,000 lighter cavalry, including Arab horse archers and Syrian lancers. His infantry numbered 20,000, solid troops but secondary to his cavalry arm. Total force, 40,000 soldiers, fresh, well-supplied, fighting on ground they'd chosen. Aurelian's 15,000 legionaries were exhausted from their forced march, operating at the end of a supply line that stretched 800 miles, facing an enemy who'd picked the perfect battlefield to demonstrate why Roman infantry tactics were obsolete. Zabdas deployed his army in a classic cavalry-heavy formation. Cataphracts in the center, Arab horse archers on the flanks, infantry in reserve. His plan was simple and sound. Let the cataphracts shatter the Roman center with a massed charge. Use the horse archers to harass the flanks, then send in infantry to finish survivors. It was the same tactic that had destroyed 3 Roman armies already. It should have worked again. But Zabdas had never faced Aurelian, and he was about to learn that sometimes the best tactics aren't about fighting. They're about making your enemy chase you until they can't fight anymore. The geography of Immae made Zabdas's confidence entirely rational. The valley stretched approximately 4 miles east-west and 2 miles north-south, enough space for 40,000 soldiers to deploy in optimal formations without crowding. The terrain elevation varied by less than 50 feet across the entire battlefield, meaning cavalry charges wouldn't be disrupted by sudden slopes or hidden depressions. Ground conditions were perfect. Dry, hard-packed earth that wouldn't bog down horses even at full gallop. The Orontes River to the west provided a natural boundary that prevented Roman flanking maneuvers, while the low hills to the east gave Palmyrene scouts elevated observation positions. Think about what this meant tactically. Zabdas could see every Roman movement from his hilltop observation posts. His cataphracts had unlimited room to build devastating momentum. His horse archers could operate on both flanks without worrying about terrain obstacles. And Aurelian's infantry had nowhere to hide, nowhere to anchor defensive formations against natural terrain features. It was cavalry paradise. Here's what the Roman sources don't tell you about Zabdas's battle plan. It was based on 5 years of proven success against Roman armies. In 267, Palmyrene cataphracts had shattered a 12,000-man Roman expeditionary force near Damascus using exactly this formation. Cataphract charge in the center, horse archers on flanks, infantry finishing survivors. Roman casualties, over 8,000 dead. Palmyrene casualties, fewer than 200. In 269, a similar battle near Tyana had destroyed another Roman force attempting to retake Anatolia. In 270, Zabdas himself had commanded the Egyptian invasion, and his cavalry had broken 3 separate Roman defensive lines through pure shock charges. The tactical doctrine was perfect, field-tested, and had never failed. Zabdas had no reason to believe Immae would be different. The Palmyrene cataphracts themselves were the most fearsome cavalry formation in the ancient world. And understanding why requires appreciating the sheer physics of their design. Each cataphract wore scale armor made from thousands of overlapping iron plates, covering torso, arms, thighs, and sometimes even the face. Total armor weight, approximately 60 pounds per rider. The horses wore their own armor, iron plates protecting chest, flanks, and head, adding another 80 pounds. Each rider carried a 12-foot Kantos lance made of ash wood with an iron tip, weighing about 15 pounds and designed to be thrust underarm while charging. Total weight the warhorse was carrying: rider, 170 pounds, rider's armor, 60 pounds, horse armor, 80 pounds, lance and weapons, 20 pounds, saddle and gear, 15 pounds, approximately 345 pounds. A properly bred warhorse could carry this weight at full gallop for short distances, building enough momentum that the lance strike alone could punch through a shield, through the man holding it, and sometimes through a second man behind him. Think about that penetrating power. One cataphract charging at full speed generated enough kinetic energy to kill 2 men with a single lance thrust. Zabdas deployed his 4,000 cataphracts in a formation that maximized their shock value. A massive wedge approximately 400 yards wide and 10 ranks deep, positioned 800 yards from the Roman lines. The wedge formation was crucial because it concentrated maximum force at the point of contact. When 400 armored horsemen in the first rank hit an infantry line simultaneously, even the most disciplined troops would break from the sheer physical impact. Behind them, 3,600 more cataphracts would exploit the breach, widening the gap until the entire Roman center collapsed. Zabdas had used this exact formation at Damascus and watched it destroy Roman cohesion in less than 10 minutes. His Arab horse archers, 8,000 mounted bowmen recruited from desert tribes allied with Palmyra, deployed on both flanks in loose formations designed for mobility. These weren't shock troops. They were harassers. Their composite bows had an effective range of 150 yards, and their tactics were simple. Ride close enough to launch arrows at Roman formations, then retreat before the Romans could respond, repeating the process until enemy morale collapsed or formations broke. The horse archers had one critical advantage. Roman legionary javelins, the Pila, had a maximum effective range of only 30 yards. As long as the Arabs stayed beyond that distance, they could fire arrows with impunity while Roman infantry stood helpless. But here's where Zabdas made his fatal assumption. He'd studied Roman tactics from previous battles and concluded that Aurelian would deploy in the traditional Roman manner. Heavy infantry in the center formed into cohorts with shields locked, cavalry on the wings to screen flanks and pursue broken enemies, skirmishers in front to harass the Palmyrene advance. It was standard Roman doctrine dating back 400 years to Caesar's campaigns in Gaul. Zabdas's plan was designed specifically to counter this deployment. Cataphracts would smash the infantry center while horse archers pinned down the Roman cavalry wings, preventing them from flanking. Once the center broke, the battle was over. Simple, proven, unstoppable. What Zabdas didn't know, couldn't know because no Roman general had ever tried it before, was that Aurelian had completely abandoned traditional doctrine. When the Roman army deployed at dawn on March 30th, Palmyrene scouts galloping back to Zabdas's command position brought reports that made no tactical sense. The Roman cavalry wasn't on the wings. It was deployed in front of the infantry, between the legionary formations and the Palmyrene army. The infantry wasn't advancing. It was holding position 200 yards back, formed into tight defensive squares, as if preparing to receive a charge that wasn't coming yet. And strangest of all, the Roman cavalry formations looked thin, undermanned, almost like they were screening something rather than preparing to fight. Zabdas studied the Roman deployment through the morning haze and saw what appeared to be a desperate, improvised formation from an outnumbered commander who knew he was beaten. Aurelian had put his weakest troops, light cavalry, in front, where they'd be the first to break when the cataphracts charged. The Roman infantry was too far back to support them. It looked like Aurelian was sacrificing his cavalry to buy time for his infantry to retreat. Zabdas smiled and gave the order his cataphracts had been waiting for. Advance to charging position. In the next 90 minutes, he would learn that sometimes what looks like desperation is actually the most brilliant tactical deception in Roman military history. Dawn, March 272. Aurelian's army deployed on the northern end of the Immae Valley in a formation that made his officers think their emperor had lost his mind. Instead of the traditional Roman deployment, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings. Aurelian put his cavalry in front, his infantry behind them in compressed ranks, and gave orders that seemed tactically insane. When the Palmyrene cataphracts charged, the Roman cavalry would retreat. Not fight, not hold. Retreat at full gallop toward the infantry lines, drawing the enemy cataphracts after them. Then, at a signal only Aurelian would give, the cavalry would split to the flanks, the infantry would lock shields, and the exhausted cataphracts would crash into fresh legionary formations at point-blank range. It was a feigned retreat tactic that required perfect timing, incredible discipline, and absolute trust that your cavalry wouldn't actually break and run for real. One mistake. Cavalry retreating too fast, infantry not forming quickly enough, cataphracts pulling up before exhaustion, and the entire Roman army would shatter. Aurelian's senior cavalry commander, a Dalmatian officer named Probus, listened to the plan and asked the obvious question. How do we make the cataphracts chase us long enough to exhaust themselves without them realizing it's a trap? Aurelian's answer was simple. Make them angry. Make them think they're winning. Make them chase glory until their horses collapse. It was insanity disguised as tactics, and every man in the Roman army knew they were about to bet their lives on whether their emperor's plan would work or get them all killed in the next 2 hours. The tactical briefing Aurelian conducted at 5 a.m., just before sunrise, was unprecedented in Roman military history. Normally, battle plans were shared only with senior officers, who then transmitted orders down the chain of command. Aurelian assembled every centurion, every cavalry decurion, every unit commander in his army, approximately 300 officers total, and explained the entire plan in detail because he needed every single man to understand that the retreat was choreographed, not real. Your cavalry will run, he told them, and your men will watch them run and think they're cowards. Some of your soldiers will break formation to help them. If that happens, we all die. Your job is to keep your men locked in position no matter what they see, no matter how bad it looks. The cavalry isn't fleeing, they're fishing, and the bait is their own lives. Think about the psychological challenge he was demanding. Roman military culture for 500 years had been built on never retreating, never showing weakness, standing firm until death. Aurelian was asking his cavalry to perform the one act that violated every instinct and tradition, and asking his infantry to watch their cavalry run without trying to help. Here's what the sources don't tell you about the specific mechanics of Aurelian's trap. The cavalry deployment was precise and calculated down to the yard. Probus commanded the 3,000 heavy cavalry, positioned 800 yards in front of the infantry lines in a formation that appeared thin and vulnerable. Only 4 ranks deep instead of the usual 8, spread across a front of approximately 600 yards. Behind them, 2,000 light cavalry formed loose screening formations on both flanks. Their job to make the Roman cavalry force look larger than it actually was, while staying out of direct combat. The infantry, 10,000 legionaries, stood in compressed formations 200 yards behind the cavalry, far enough back that it would take the cavalry 90 seconds of full gallop to reach them if they had to retreat. That 90-second retreat distance was crucial. It was long enough to exhaust pursuing cataphracts, but short enough that Roman cavalry wouldn't lose cohesion during the flight. Aurelian's orders to Probus were mathematically precise and terrifying. When the cataphracts charge, you retreat at 3/4 speed, fast enough to look like you're fleeing in panic, slow enough that they think they're catching you. Never let them close within 50 yards. If they get that close, they'll realize your horses aren't exhausted and pull back. Keep them chasing for at least 70 minutes. At my signal, 3 trumpet blasts. Split your formations left and right, 45-degree angles, and clear the line of advance within 10 seconds. The infantry will be formed and waiting. If you're not clear in 10 seconds, the cataphracts hit you from behind, and we lose everything. Let that sink in. Probus and his 3,000 cavalry had to maintain a controlled retreat for 70 minutes, judging distance continuously, never getting caught, never pulling too far ahead, while wearing armor and controlling frightened horses and knowing that one mistake meant death by lance from behind. The margin of error was 0. But here's where Aurelian's plan became genuinely brilliant, or genuinely insane, depending on whether it worked. He'd calculated the physics of exhaustion with precision that shouldn't have been possible in 272 AD. A warhorse carrying 345 pounds of combined weight, rider, armor, weapons, gear, could maintain full gallop for approximately 8 to 10 minutes before exhaustion began reducing speed. After 20 minutes, the horse would slow to a trot, whether the rider wanted it to or not. After 40 minutes of continuous exertion, even walking became labored. After 70 minutes, the horse would be physically incapable of generating the momentum needed to break through an infantry shield wall. Aurelian had somehow figured out, through battlefield observation, through interrogating captured Palmyrene cavalry, or through sheer tactical genius, exactly how long cataphracts could pursue before their horses gave out. And he'd built his entire battle plan around exhausting enemy cavalry without fighting them. The psychological component was equally calculated. Aurelian needed the Palmyrene cataphracts to commit fully to the pursuit, to believe they were winning so completely that they'd chase Roman cavalry beyond the point of tactical sense. That meant the Roman retreat had to look genuine. Panicked riders, scattered formations, some cavalry even throwing down shields to lighten their load and ride faster. Probus assigned 50 volunteers to perform exactly this deception. These men would visibly panic during the retreat, breaking from formation, discarding equipment, looking like they'd broken psychologically. It was theater designed to convince Zabdas that his cataphracts had shattered Roman morale. The 50 volunteers knew they were most likely to die if the trap failed. They'd be the furthest from safety when the cataphracts closed in. But every single man volunteered because Aurelian had spent 3 weeks on the march building. Absolute trust that his plans worked. 7 a.m. The sun cleared the eastern hills, illuminating the Immae Valley in harsh morning light. Palmyrene scouts on the hilltops could now clearly see the Roman deployment and confirmed what Zabdas suspected. The Romans were deployed in a weak, desperate formation with their worst troops forward. Zabdas gave the order. 4,000 cataphracts began advancing at a walk, building gradually toward a trot, then a canter, preparing for the final acceleration to full gallop that would take them into the Roman cavalry lines. Aurelian, mounted on his warhorse 200 yards away, watched the Palmyrene advance through the dust and sunlight. His face was expressionless, the same cold mask he'd worn through 30 years of warfare. His officers stood nearby, waiting for orders, wondering if their emperor had just engineered the most brilliant tactical deception in Roman history, or condemned them all to death in the next 2 hours. Probus, commanding the forward cavalry, raised his hand in salute, the signal that his men were ready to run, ready to trust that Aurelian's insane mathematics of exhaustion would save their lives. And across the valley, 4,000 Palmyrene cataphracts accelerated to full charge, thinking they were about to destroy the Roman cavalry in 5 minutes and then butcher the infantry behind them. What they'd actually done was exactly what Aurelian wanted. Committed their elite forces to a pursuit that would transform their greatest strength into fatal weakness. The trap was set. The bait was running. And in 90 minutes, the Palmyrene Empire would learn that sometimes losing a race is more deadly than losing a fight. 10 a.m. Zabdas gave the order, and 4,000 Palmyrene cataphracts began their charge, the most terrifying sight in ancient warfare. These weren't light cavalry skirmishing at range. These were human tanks, each man and horse covered in overlapping iron scales that could turn aside most arrows and spear thrusts. The riders carried 12-foot lances held underarm, designed to punch through shields and men in a single thrust. Each horse weighed 200 pounds and was bred for power rather than speed. When they hit a charge at full momentum, the kinetic impact was devastating. Infantry formations collapsed, shield walls shattered. Men were thrown backward by the sheer force of impact. Zabdas had positioned his cataphracts 800 yards from the Roman lines and sent them forward at a trot that gradually accelerated to a full gallop. The ground shook. The sound was like continuous thunder. Roman cavalry, lighter, unarmored, mounted on horses bred for speed, saw 4,000 armored horsemen bearing down on them like an avalanche of iron and steel. And then, exactly as Aurelian had ordered, they turned and ran. Not a fighting retreat, not a tactical withdrawal. They turned their horses and galloped full speed toward their own infantry lines, as if in complete panic. Zabdas, watching from the Palmyrene center, saw what he'd been hoping for. Roman cavalry breaking before contact, fleeing toward their own lines, creating chaos. He gave the order to pursue. The cataphracts accelerated, chasing glory, thinking they'd just broken the back of Aurelian's army in the first 5 minutes of battle. What Zabdas didn't realize was that he'd just ordered his elite heavy cavalry to do exactly what Aurelian wanted: chase Roman horsemen across 800 yards of open ground in full armor under the Syrian sun. The visual spectacle of 4,000 cataphracts charging in wedge formation was designed to break enemy morale before contact. The wedge itself stretched approximately 400 yards wide at the base and 200 yards deep. A massive triangle of armored cavalry that looked unstoppable. The front rank, 400 horsemen riding knee to knee with lances lowered, presented a solid wall of iron and steel moving at 20 miles per hour. Behind them, 9 more ranks of cataphracts followed in tight formation, ready to exploit whatever breach the front rank created. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Soldiers who'd faced cataphract charges described the experience as watching an iron avalanche. You knew it was coming. You knew it would crush you. And every instinct screamed to run before it arrived. That's exactly what the Roman cavalry appeared to do. Probus, commanding the Roman cavalry from the center of his formation, gave the signal, a raised sword that flashed in the sunlight. And 3,000 Roman horsemen wheeled around and galloped toward their own lines. The movement looked chaotic, panicked, exactly like cavalry that had broken psychologically. Some riders visibly threw down their shields, part of the 50 volunteers performing the deception. But to Palmyrene observers, it looked like genuine panic. Others appeared to scatter left and right, breaking formation. The Roman light cavalry on the flanks joined the retreat, adding to the impression of complete collapse. Within 30 seconds, the entire Roman cavalry force was fleeing at full speed, and the Palmyrene cataphracts accelerated to pursue what looked like a routed enemy. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those first 5 minutes. Probus's cavalry wasn't actually running at full speed. They were galloping at approximately 3/4 pace, fast enough to look like genuine flight, slow enough that their horses weren't expending maximum energy. The cataphracts, by contrast, were running at full gallop because Zabdas had ordered maximum pursuit speed to catch the Romans before they could regroup. Think about that energy differential. Roman horses were running at 75% exertion. Palmyrene horses, carrying 345 pounds each, were running at 100% exertion. Over distance, that 25% difference would compound into complete exhaustion for the Palmyrenes, while Roman horses remained relatively fresh. 10:08 a.m. The cataphracts had been chasing for 8 minutes and had closed the gap from 800 yards to approximately 200 yards. They were catching up, exactly as Aurelian's plan required. The Roman cavalry couldn't pull too far ahead, or the cataphracts would realize the retreat was controlled and break off pursuit. But they also couldn't let the cataphracts get within lance range, or the trap would fail before exhaustion set in. Probus was controlling the retreat pace by watching the Palmyrene front rank over his shoulder, adjusting speed to maintain exactly 150 to 200 yards of separation. It was the most dangerous horsemanship any Roman cavalry had ever attempted, riding at speed while looking backward, judging distances, controlling frightened horses, and trusting that the riders around you were doing the same without collision. The Palmyrene cataphracts, watching the Romans flee just ahead of them, were experiencing exactly what Zabdas hoped: the euphoria of impending victory. They'd broken Roman cavalry without even making contact. Now they just needed to catch the fleeing riders, cut them down, and then hit the Roman infantry from behind while the foot soldiers were still reeling from watching their cavalry destroyed. Every cataphract in that wedge formation believed the battle was already won. What none of them realized was that their horses were already beginning to labor. 8 minutes of full-speed pursuit and 345 pounds of combined weight was approaching the biological limit. Horses were beginning to foam at the mouth, the first sign of cardiovascular stress. Breathing was becoming labored. But the riders were so focused on the chase, so convinced they were winning, that they didn't notice their mounts slowing from gallop to fast canter. 10:15 a.m., 15 minutes into the pursuit. The cataphracts had now chased Roman cavalry for nearly 2 miles across open ground in full armor. The gap had stabilized at 150 yards, close enough to maintain hope of catching the Romans, far enough that actual contact remained impossible. Zabdas, watching from his command position, saw his cataphracts disappearing into the distance, still chasing, still pursuing what looked like victory. His Arab cavalry commanders on the flanks were asking whether they should support the pursuit. Zabdas waved them off. The cataphracts didn't need support to run down broken cavalry. His infantry commanders were asking whether they should advance to support the breakthrough. Zabdas ordered them to hold position. Everything was going according to plan. The Roman cavalry was fleeing. The cataphracts were about to catch them. And then the Roman infantry, isolated and unsupported, would be destroyed by a combination of cavalry and fresh infantry assault. What Zabdas couldn't see from 1,500 yards away was that his cataphracts' horses were dying on their feet. 20 minutes of continuous pursuit had pushed the animals beyond their cardiovascular limits. Foam was now mixed with blood from strained lungs. Some horses were stumbling, their legs trembling from exhaustion. The wedge formation was beginning to lose cohesion as faster horses pulled ahead and exhausted horses fell behind. The front rank, 400 cataphracts who'd been chasing hardest, were now riding horses that were barely maintaining a canter. But the riders couldn't stop. The Romans were right there, just 150 yards ahead. Victory was seconds away. All they needed was one more burst of speed to close the gap. And Probus, glancing back over his shoulder at the pursuing cataphracts, saw what he'd been waiting for. Palmyrene horses with heads lowered, mouths foaming, gaits becoming irregular. The cataphracts were still coming, still chasing, but their momentum was gone. Their horses were finished. In the next 60 seconds, Aurelian would give the signal, and 4,000 elite cavalrymen would discover that they'd chased themselves into a trap and they couldn't escape. The most feared heavy cavalry in the ancient world was about to become target practice for Roman infantry, who hadn't moved from their positions in 30 minutes. The Palmyrene cataphracts pursued the retreating Roman cavalry for 90 minutes. Let that sink in. 90 minutes of continuous pursuit across rolling terrain under the Mediterranean sun in full armor. Here's what that meant physically. Each cataphract wore approximately 60 pounds of iron scale armor covering his torso, arms, and thighs. His horse carried another 80 pounds of iron plates protecting its chest, flanks, and head. Total weight the horse was carrying: the rider, around 170 pounds, the armor, 140 pounds, weapons, 20 pounds, and riding gear, 15 pounds, about 345 pounds total. A warhorse in peak condition can carry that weight at a gallop for maybe 5 to 10 minutes before exhaustion sets in. After that, the horse has to slow to a trot or walk, or its heart gives out. The Palmyrene horses had been charging for 90 minutes, following Roman cavalry that kept staying just out of reach, close enough to look like they were about to be caught, far enough that the cataphracts couldn't close the final gap. Aurelian's cavalry wasn't trying to escape. They were running at a measured pace designed to exhaust the pursuing horses without exhausting their own. By the 40-minute mark, Palmyrene horses were foaming at the mouth, their gallops reduced to labored trots. By 60 minutes, dozens of horses were collapsing mid-pursuit, riders thrown to the ground in armor so heavy they couldn't stand back up. By 90 minutes, the cataphracts were still pursuing, still chasing what looked like a broken Roman cavalry force. But their horses were done, heaving, stumbling, barely able to maintain a walk. And then Aurelian gave the signal. The biological mathematics of what was happening to the Palmyrene horses was brutal and precise. A war horse's cardiovascular system operates at maximum efficiency when carrying moderate weight at sustainable speeds. The moment you add 345 pounds and demand sustained galloping, you're forcing the animal's heart to work at 150% to 180% of optimal capacity. The heart rate spikes from a resting 30 to 40 beats per minute to over 200 beats per minute. Blood oxygen levels drop. Lactic acid builds up in muscle tissue faster than the circulatory system can clear it. After 10 minutes at this exertion level, muscle efficiency drops by 30%. After 20 minutes, by 50%. After 40 minutes, the horse enters cardiovascular crisis. The heart is pumping as fast as it can. But oxygen delivery to muscles can't keep pace with demand. Think about what this meant for the cataphracts. By the 40-minute mark, their horses were already operating at half strength, and the riders couldn't tell because the horses were still moving, still chasing, driven by training and the momentum of the 4,000 animals around them. Here's what the sources don't tell you about the progressive collapse of the Palmyrene pursuit. At the 20-minute mark, the cataphract wedge formation began breaking apart. The strongest horses, younger animals, better bred stock, maintained their pace, but older or less conditioned horses started falling behind. The tight, coordinated wedge that had looked unstoppable at the start of the charge was now strung out across nearly a mile of ground. The front 800 cataphracts were still maintaining something close to pursuit speed. The middle 2,000 were laboring, but still moving. The rear 1,200 had slowed to trots or walks, their horses physically incapable of maintaining formation. Zabdas, watching from his distant command position, couldn't see this dispersal clearly through the dust and distance. What he saw was his cataphracts still advancing, still chasing the Romans, apparently on the verge of contact. At the 40-minute mark, horses began dying. Not collapsing, dying. Approximately 150 Palmyrene war horses suffered catastrophic heart failure and dropped mid-stride, throwing riders who hit the ground in 60 pounds of armor. A cataphract thrown from a horse at speed doesn't just fall, he impacts the ground with enough force to break bones, crack ribs, sometimes rupture internal organs. The scale armor that protected against swords and lances became a cage that turned falls into death sentences. Riders who survived the fall couldn't stand back up because the armor was too heavy to move in without assistance. They lay in the dirt, watching their comrades continue the chase, gasping in the heat, waiting for the battle to end one way or another. At the 60-minute mark, the front ranks of the cataphracts, the 800 riders who'd been chasing hardest, were now mounted on animals that were essentially finished as combat assets. Their horses were still moving, but only because the riders were using spurs and whips to force them forward. Foam mixed with blood was coming from the horses' mouths and nostrils, a sign of pulmonary hemorrhaging from extreme exertion. The horses' heads were lowered, a posture that indicates the animal is operating on pure survival instinct rather than responding to commands. Some horses were stumbling, their legs trembling from muscular exhaustion. Yet the cataphracts kept riding, kept pursuing, because the Roman cavalry was still ahead of them, just 150 yards away. Tantalizingly close, seemingly catchable if they could just maintain pace for a few more minutes. The Roman cavalry, by contrast, had been managing their horses' exertion through calculated pace control. Probus had kept his 3,000 cavalry running at three-quarter speed for the entire 90 minutes, which meant their horses were tired but not destroyed. More importantly, Roman horses were carrying far less weight. Riders in light armor, no horse armor, total weight around 220 pounds compared to the cataphracts' 345 pounds. That 125-pound differential was the difference between exhaustion and catastrophic failure. Roman horses at 90 minutes could still maneuver, still respond to commands, still generate enough speed to escape if the trap failed. Palmyrene horses at 90 minutes were biological wrecks held upright by momentum and training. 11:30 a.m. 90 minutes after the chase began, Aurelian sits on his horse, watching his cavalry lead the Palmyrene cataphracts closer to the Roman infantry lines. The Legionaries have been standing motionless in tight formations for the entire pursuit, watching their cavalry flee while enemy cataphracts chase them across miles of ground. Some of the younger soldiers have been muttering about cowardice, wondering why their cavalry won't turn and fight. The centurions have been beating them silent with vine sticks, reminding them that Aurelian's orders are absolute. Now, as the Roman cavalry approaches within 400 yards of the infantry lines, with exhausted cataphracts still pursuing 150 yards behind them, every Roman soldier can see what Aurelian has done. The Palmyrene horses are stumbling. Their formation has disintegrated. They're still coming, but they're coming slowly, without momentum, without the devastating shock power that makes cataphracts lethal. Aurelian raises his hand. 3 trumpets blast the signal across the battlefield, a sound every Roman soldier has been waiting 90 minutes to hear. Probus receives the signal and gives the order his cavalry has been dreading and praying for. Split formation. Clear the line of advance. Execute now. 3,000 Roman cavalry, still moving at speed, suddenly split left and right at 45-degree angles with precision that shouldn't have been possible after 90 minutes of controlled retreat. Within 10 seconds, the entire Roman cavalry force has cleared the center of the battlefield, revealing what had been hidden behind them for 90 minutes. 10,000 Roman legionaries in perfect formation, shields locked, javelins ready, standing motionless 200 yards ahead of the Palmyrene cataphracts. And 4,000 elite Palmyrene cavalrymen, mounted on horses too exhausted to turn, too exhausted to accelerate, too exhausted to do anything except stumble forward, suddenly realize they've been chasing bait for 90 minutes. They're 200 yards from a Roman shield wall, their horses can barely walk, and there's no way to stop. The trap has sprung, and in the next 30 minutes, the most feared cavalry in the ancient world is about to be systematically destroyed by infantry they can't even reach. 11:30 a.m. The Roman cavalry, which had been fleeing for 90 minutes, suddenly split to the left and right flanks with practiced precision, revealing what had been hidden behind them. 15,000 legionaries in perfect formation, fresh, rested, shields locked, javelins ready. The Palmyrene cataphracts, who'd been chasing victory for 90 minutes, suddenly found themselves 200 yards from a Roman infantry line, with horses too exhausted to turn, too exhausted to charge, barely able to stop. Zabdas, watching from the Palmyrene center 200 yards back, realized in that instant that he'd just destroyed his own army. His cataphracts, the elite heavy cavalry that had won every battle for 5 years, were now trapped between Roman cavalry reforming on their flanks and Roman infantry waiting directly ahead. Their horses were finished, heaving and trembling, incapable of generating the momentum needed to break through shield walls. Some riders tried to wheel around and retreat, but horses in 220 pounds of combined armor can't execute sharp turns at speed. Others tried to charge anyway, hoping momentum and lances could compensate for exhausted mounts. The results were catastrophic. Roman infantry, drilled in anti-cavalry tactics that went back to Hannibal, locked shields in a testudo formation so tight that lances couldn't penetrate the gaps. Cataphracts who hit the shield wall at reduced speed found their lances shattering against overlapping bronze without breaking through. Then the javelins came. 6,000 Pila thrown at point-blank range into massed cavalry with nowhere to maneuver. A pilum hitting a horse in the chest at 15 yards, punched through armor, and killed the animal instantly. Riders were thrown from dying horses, hitting the ground in 60 pounds of armor, unable to stand, unable to fight, helpless as legionaries closed in with gladi and finished them where they lay. The Roman testudo formation that the cataphracts faced was a defensive masterpiece refined over 300 years of fighting cavalry. The legionaries formed into cohorts of roughly 500 men each, creating 20 separate shield walls spread across a 600-yard front. Each cohort locked shields front, sides, and overhead. creating what looked like an armored tortoise shell with no gaps, no weak points, no vulnerable angles for cavalry lances to exploit. The shields themselves were scutum, rectangular tower shields made of layered wood and faced with bronze, weighing about 22 pounds each and measuring 4 feet tall by 2.5 feet wide. When locked together, they created an overlapping barrier that cavalry lances couldn't penetrate. Think about the geometry. A 12-foot lance thrust by an exhausted horse generates maybe 200 to 300 pounds of force. A locked shield wall with men bracing against each other can absorb 2,000 pounds of force without breaking. The physics made penetration impossible. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those first 30 seconds of contact. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter that the Palmyrines couldn't even fight back against. Approximately 800 cataphracts in the front ranks tried to charge the Roman lines despite their exhausted horses. Their mounts managed maybe a stumbling trot, generating 1/10 the momentum of a proper cavalry charge. When they hit the shield walls at reduced speed, the lances either shattered against bronze or glanced off the overlapping shields without penetrating. The riders themselves, expecting the devastating impact of a successful charge, were thrown forward by the sudden stop, some falling from their saddles, others clinging desperately to horses that could no longer respond to commands. And then the javelins came. 11:31 a.m., Roman centurions gave the order, and 6,000 legionaries in the front 3 ranks threw their Pila in coordinated volleys. The pilum was designed specifically as an anti-cavalry weapon. A 7-foot shaft with a 2-foot iron head that bent on impact, making it impossible to pull out quickly. When 6,000 Pila strike a mass of cavalry packed into a 400-yard front, the mathematics are simple. Every javelin hits something. Horses screamed as iron punched through scale armor and buried itself in muscle and organs. The sound was unlike anything in ancient warfare. 4,000 horses shrieking in pain and terror simultaneously, a noise that soldiers who survived Immae would hear in nightmares for the rest of their lives. Within 60 seconds, approximately 1,200 horses were down, killed outright or thrashing with Pila embedded in their chests. The riders, thrown from dying mounts, hit the ground in 60 pounds of scale armor that turned a simple fall into a crippling impact. But here's where the Palmyrine disaster became genuinely insane. Cataphracts who fell couldn't stand back up. Scale armor was designed to be worn while mounted, the weight distributed across the horse, the rider able to move because the horse did the moving. On the ground, that same armor became a prison. A cataphract thrown from his horse lay on his back like an overturned turtle, limbs flailing, unable to generate the leverage needed to stand without assistance. Some tried rolling onto their stomachs and pushing up with their arms. The armor's weight made it impossible. Others called for help from nearby riders, but those riders were fighting their own battles just to stay mounted. Roman legionaries, advancing through the chaos, with short swords drawn, found targets who literally couldn't defend themselves. A gladius thrust upward through the armpit, one of the few gaps in scale armor, killed instantly. Thrusts into the throat, through the eye slits of helmets, into the groin where armor didn't cover. Everywhere Roman infantry looked, they found armored men who couldn't stand, couldn't run, could only die. The cataphracts who'd avoided the initial javelin volleys tried to retreat, but their exhausted horses couldn't execute the maneuver. Turning a 200-pound warhorse in heavy armor requires the animal to plant its hooves and pivot. A movement that demands muscular strength these horses no longer possessed. Riders tried wheeling left or right to escape, and their mounts simply stumbled sideways, legs giving out, collapsing in slow motion. Some cataphracts dismounted voluntarily, hoping to fight on foot. They discovered immediately why cavalry fought from horseback. In 60 pounds of armor, they could barely walk. They certainly couldn't run. They couldn't effectively swing their 12-foot lances, which were designed for mounted combat. And they were surrounded by 10,000 legionaries, who'd spent 90 minutes watching and were now advancing with professional efficiency to finish what the javelins had started. 11:35 a.m. 5 minutes after the trap sprung, approximately 1,800 Palmyrene cataphracts were already dead or dying, killed by javelins, cut down by legionaries, or crushed when their own horses fell on them. Another 1,000 were wounded, pinned under dead horses or lying helpless in armor they couldn't move in. The remaining 1,200 cataphracts in the rear, those who'd fallen furthest behind during the pursuit, saw the slaughter ahead and made a rational decision. They turned their exhausted horses and tried to gallop back toward Palmyrene lines. But Aurelian had anticipated this too. The 3,000 Roman cavalry that had split to the flanks were now reforming and sweeping around to cut off retreat. The Palmyrene cataphracts, who'd spent 90 minutes chasing Roman cavalry, were now being chased by those same Romans. Except now, the Palmyrenes were exhausted and the Romans were fresh. Zabdas, watching from his command position, sees his entire tactical plan collapsing in real time. His cataphracts, the elite force that was supposed to shatter Roman infantry and win the battle in 30 minutes, have been destroyed without achieving a single objective. His Arab cavalry on the flanks are now facing Roman cavalry sweeping toward them. His infantry, positioned 800 yards behind the cataphract charge, are too far away to intervene. And worst of all, the Roman legionaries who just annihilated his cavalry are now advancing in perfect formation toward his remaining forces. The Battle of Immae isn't over, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. In 90 minutes, Aurelian has transformed Palmyra's greatest strength, their invincible cataphracts, into their fatal weakness. And in the next 2 hours, the remaining 36,000 Palmyrene soldiers will learn that when your elite forces are gone, courage and numbers don't matter. What matters is whether your enemy gives you time to retreat. And Aurelian doesn't believe in mercy. 12 aroused p.m. The Palmyrene cataphracts were dying in a way no Roman soldier had thought possible. Not from superior cavalry, not from brilliant tactics, but from simple exhaustion weaponized by Aurelian's genius. Roman infantry, which had stood motionless for 90 minutes watching their own cavalry flee, now advanced in perfect formation, chopping down armored horsemen who couldn't fight back because their mounts were too tired to move. Think about the psychological reversal. 90 minutes ago, these same cataphracts had been charging towards certain victory, chasing broken Roman cavalry, convinced the battle was already won. Now they were trapped, surrounded, dying in hundreds, while their horses stood trembling and unable to respond to commands. Aurelian had turned Rome's greatest weakness, inferior cavalry, into a strength by making the enemy's cavalry strength irrelevant. The killing was methodical and brutal. Legionaries targeted horses first. A gladius thrust into an exhausted horse's neck or chest dropped the animal immediately, throwing riders who couldn't remount because their armor was too heavy. Cataphracts who managed to stay mounted found themselves surrounded by infantry who simply pulled them from their saddles. 60 pounds of scale armor makes excellent handholds and stabbed upward through gaps in the armor at armpits and groins. Those who fell and tried to surrender were killed anyway, because Aurelian had given standing orders. No prisoners from the cataphract corps, they were too dangerous to let live. The Arab horse archers on the Palmyrene flanks, watching the cataphracts die, made a rational decision and retreated without engaging. The Syrian infantry, seeing their elite cavalry destroyed in 30 minutes without achieving anything, began falling back toward Antioch. And Zabdas, who'd commanded Zenobia's armies to 5 years of victories, gave the order that would haunt him until his death. Retreat, save what you can, the battle is lost. 12:00 p.m. The Roman infantry's advance was textbook legionary doctrine, executed with precision that revealed exactly why Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world. The cohorts moved forward in 3 distinct waves. The first wave, approximately 3,000 legionaries, engaged the cataphracts directly, targeting horses and dismounted riders with systematic efficiency. These men worked in pairs. One legionary would hook his scutum shield around a cataphract's lance, yanking the rider off balance, while his partner thrust a gladius upward through armor gaps. The second wave moved through gaps to finish wounded enemies. The third wave, 4,000 legionaries in reserve, stood ready for counterattacks that never came. The Romans were killing $4,000 elite cavalry while maintaining formation integrity and keeping 2/3 of their forces ready for additional combat. This wasn't battle. It was industrial-scale killing with military efficiency. Here's what the sources don't tell you about Aurelian's no prisoners order for the cataphract corps. It was strategically calculated, not emotional revenge. Cataphracts required years of training. Riders had to learn to control horses while wearing 60 pounds of armor, master the 12-foot lance, and coordinate in tight formations. Each cataphract represented an investment of approximately 3,000 denarii, more than most Roman soldiers earned in 5 years. Killing them all meant Zenobia couldn't rebuild her heavy cavalry, even if she survived the war. It was genocide as military strategy. And it worked because Aurelian understood that wars are won by destroying your enemy's capacity to fight, not just their will. 12:15 p.m. 15 minutes into the slaughter, the cataphract casualties were catastrophic. Of the original 4,000 who charged, approximately 2,800 were dead, killed by javelins during initial contact, cut down by advancing legionaries, or crushed when their horses collapsed on top of them. Another 900 were wounded so severely they couldn't fight, legs broken from falls, limbs severed by gladius strikes, throats cut as they lay helpless in armor they couldn't escape. The remaining 300 were either fleeing on exhausted horses that could barely trot, or had dismounted and were trying to surrender. A cataphract who threw down his weapon was killed the same as one who kept fighting. The Arab horse archers on the Palmyrene flanks, 8,000 mounted bowmen positioned to harass Roman infantry once the cataphracts broke through, saw the slaughter unfolding and made calculations that preserved their lives at the cost of Palmyra's empire. These weren't professional soldiers with regimental loyalty. They were tribal warriors hired with gold and promises of plunder. They hadn't agreed to die fighting Romans who just destroyed 4,000 cataphracts in 30 minutes. The Arab commanders gave quiet orders. The horse archers began withdrawing in organized groups, not fleeing in panic, but disengaging with the professional detachment of mercenaries who decided the contract wasn't worth dying for. By 12:20 p.m., approximately 6,000 Arab cavalry had left the battlefield entirely, riding east toward the desert. The Syrian infantry, 20,000 soldiers positioned 800 yards behind the cataphract charge, watched their entire tactical situation collapse. Their elite heavy cavalry was gone. Their cavalry flanks were retreating, and advancing toward them across the bloody ground were 10,000 Roman legionaries who just demonstrated they could kill elite cavalry without taking significant casualties. Think about the psychological impact. They were facing an enemy that had just done the impossible, and they were doing it without cavalry support, without secure flanks, and without any tactical advantage except numbers. 12:25 p.m. Zabdas, commanding from 200 yards behind the original deployment, faced a decision military commanders dread: accept total defeat now and save what you can, or commit your remaining forces and risk losing everything. His cataphracts were gone. His Arab cavalry was deserting. His Syrian infantry was intact, but psychologically broken from watching the slaughter. he still outnumbered the Romans, 20,000 versus 10,000. But numbers didn't matter when morale was collapsing. He gave the order that ended the Battle of Immae. General retreat toward Antioch. Maintain formation, cavalry screen the withdrawal. It was the correct military decision, and it guaranteed Palmyra would lose the war. 1:91 p.m. The Palmyrene army was collapsing in complete disorder. Aurelian saw the lines wavering and did what he'd always done when facing broken enemies. He ordered immediate pursuit, no mercy, kill until they stop running. Roman cavalry, fresh because they'd spent 90 minutes fleeing at a controlled pace, swept around the Palmyrene flanks and began running down infantry who'd lost cohesion. It became a massacre. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about how the rout began. It started with logistics, not combat. When the retreat order came, the wagon drivers panicked and started moving toward Antioch immediately, clogging the roads the infantry needed. Roman cavalry hit the supply train from both flanks, burning everything: grain, medical supplies, spare weapons. Syrian infantry watching their supplies burn made instant calculations. If the food was gone, retreat meant starvation. The cohesion Zabdas had maintained for 30 minutes dissolved in 5 minutes of chaos. The moment the Syrian infantry broke formation, Roman cavalry turned from burning supplies to killing soldiers. Mounted cavalry running down infantry on open ground is systematically one-sided. An infantryman in armor can run at maybe 4 to 5 miles per hour for perhaps 20 minutes before exhaustion. A cavalry horse can gallop at 20 miles per hour and maintain it for miles. The mathematics are brutal. For every Palmyrene soldier who ran, there was a Roman cavalryman who caught him within 2 minutes and cut him down from behind. Syrian soldiers threw away their shields to run faster. They discarded their armor. Some fell to their knees and begged for mercy. Aurelian's orders were absolute: no prisoners. 2:00 p.m. 1 hour into the pursuit, Roman cavalry had killed approximately 5,000 fleeing Palmyrenes. Let that sink in. 5,000 dead in 60 minutes. 83 deaths per minute, more than 1 per second, sustained for an entire hour. The roads from Immae to Antioch were lined with bodies in formations that told the story of panic. Groups of 50 soldiers who'd run together and died together, cut down in clusters. Individual stragglers who'd tried hiding in ditches, hunted down by cavalry patrols, systematically combing the terrain. By 5:00 p.m., the Battle of Immae was ending. The Palmyrene Empire's field army, 40,000 soldiers who deployed that morning expecting to crush an outnumbered Roman force, had been destroyed. Casualty estimates put Palmyrene dead at 15,000 to 20,000. Roman casualties, fewer than 2,000. The kill ratio was beyond anything Romans had achieved in decades. Zabdas survived, which was worse than dying. He'd commanded Zenobia's armies to 5 years of victories, defeating Roman expeditions, conquering Egypt, holding Syria. He was considered one of the finest generals in the East. And at Immae, he'd been systematically destroyed by an opponent who never even engaged his main force. Think about his perspective. He'd positioned 40,000 troops on perfect cavalry ground. He'd sent his elite cataphracts forward in a textbook charge. He'd watched those cavalry break and run, exactly as they should have. Everything he'd done was correct according to every military manual written in the previous 500 years. And somehow, doing everything right had destroyed his army. Evening, March 30th. Zenobia receives Zabdas in her throne room with her full court present. She asks the question he's been dreading. How did 15,000 Romans destroy 40,000 of our soldiers on ground we chose? Zabdas tries to explain. The Roman cavalry retreated, his cataphracts pursued according to doctrine. But somehow the retreat was controlled and the pursuit exhausted his horses. It sounds insane even as he's saying it. But Zenobia silences the court. She studied military history, Hannibal's tactics at Cannae, Persian feigned retreats. She understands immediately what Zabdas couldn't see. Aurelian had used a tactic so old it was in military manuals from 500 years ago. But he'd executed it so perfectly that even experienced generals fell for it. The feigned retreat was theoretically understood, but nobody had ever used it against heavy cavalry specifically to exploit their exhaustion vulnerability. Aurelian had innovated within established doctrine. She gives the order that will lead to the next battle. Evacuate Antioch, withdraw to Immae, send riders to every garrison, every reserve unit, gather everything we have left. If Aurelian wants Syria, he'll have to take it from an army that knows it's fighting for survival. While his army pursued fleeing Palmyrines, Aurelian sat on his horse, watching the slaughter with the same expression he'd worn every day for 30 years, grim, cold, unsurprised. He'd just pulled off one of history's most brilliant tactical deceptions, and he was already calculating logistics for the next battle because he knew Immae hadn't won the war. It had just forced Zenobia to commit everything she had left. The intelligence painted a clear picture. Zabdas had retreated to Antioch with approximately 18,000 survivors. Egypt still held 10,000 to 15,000 Palmyrene soldiers who could be recalled if Zenobia had time. If Aurelian besieged Antioch, she'd have weeks to consolidate. If he advanced aggressively and forced another battle before she could regroup, he might destroy Palmyra's military capacity completely. Here's what the Roman sources don't tell you. Aurelian was racing against political time as much as military time. Back in Rome, the Senate was nervous about an emperor who'd seized power through military acclaim. Every week Aurelian spent in Syria was another week for rivals to plot. The Roman Empire in 272 AD didn't allow for long campaigns. Emperors who stayed in the field too long got murdered by their own officers. April 5th, 272. Zenobia's response arrived. She would evacuate Antioch and withdraw to Immae. Aurelian agreed immediately, not out of mercy, but because he wanted Zenobia to concentrate her remaining forces in one place where he could destroy them completely. Think about what Aurelian accomplished at Immae. He took 15,000 exhausted soldiers, outnumbered 2.7 to 1, fighting on terrain that favored cavalry against an enemy whose cavalry had never lost, and achieved a kill ratio of approximately 10-1. The Palmyrene cataphracts, 4,000 armored horsemen who were supposed to be the eastern answer to Roman legions, were effectively destroyed as a military force. Out of 4,000 who charged, fewer than 200 escaped. He invented, or at least perfected, the tactical feigned retreat as systematic doctrine. The idea that you could deliberately make your cavalry look broken and fleeing, use them as bait to exhaust enemy heavy cavalry, then spring a trap with fresh infantry, was revolutionary. It required discipline most armies couldn't achieve. Cavalry that would retreat on command without actually breaking, infantry that would stand motionless for 90 minutes while watching their own side lose, and a commander willing to risk his entire army on perfect timing. The basic principle, make your enemy chase you until they're too tired to fight effectively, would appear in military manuals for the next 1,000 years. Here's what military historians miss. The battle wasn't won by superior numbers or better equipment. It was won by exploiting a biological limitation nobody had weaponized before: the cardiovascular capacity of war horses under extreme load. Aurelian understood that heavy cavalry's decisive advantage depended entirely on the horse's ability to generate and sustain speed. Remove that speed through exhaustion, and you're left with heavily armored men on animals that can't move fast enough to be dangerous. He calculated the time, 90 minutes, needed to exhaust horses carrying 345 pounds. He calculated the distance his cavalry needed to maintain separation. The cataphracts at Immae weren't defeated by Roman weapons. They were defeated by their own horses' biology, weaponized through a feigned retreat that looked like cowardice, but was actually applied physics. Within 4 months, Aurelian would crush Zenobia's last army at Emesa, capture Palmyra, take Zenobia prisoner, and restore Roman control over Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. Within 2 years, he'd reconquer the Gallic Empire, reuniting all 3 pieces of Rome under one emperor for the first time in 15 years. By his death in 275 AD, murdered by his own officers, Aurelian had accomplished what everyone thought impossible. He'd restored the Roman Empire. Here's the tragedy of Immae. Almost nobody knows it happened. Ask 100 people about Roman battles, and they'll mention Cannae, where Hannibal destroyed a Roman army. They'll know Teutoburg Forest, where Germanic tribes massacred 3 legions. But Immae, the battle where Aurelian saved the Roman Empire through tactical genius and brutal discipline, forgotten, lost in the chaos of the 3rd century crisis, overshadowed by flashier disasters. Yet Immae mattered more than those famous defeats. If Aurelian loses, Zenobia consolidates the East. Rome loses Egypt permanently, the grain that feeds Italy, which means famine, revolt, collapse. The empire splinters into permanent fragments. Christianity fractures into regional churches. The concept of universal Roman civilization dies in 272 AD, instead of lasting another 200 years in the West and 200 years in the East. The historical amnesia is almost complete. Exactly 4 ancient sources mention Immae in any detail. The Historia Augusta dedicates 3 paragraphs, focusing mostly on Aurelian's courage and barely explaining the tactics. Zosimus mentions it in 1 sentence. That's it. Maybe 500 words total describing a battle where 15,000 Romans destroyed 40,000 Palmyrines and prevented the permanent collapse of Western civilization. The battles where Rome lost get commemorated. The battle where Rome was saved gets forgotten. 1 battle, 1 tactical deception, 1 blacksmith's son who understood that exhaustion could be weaponized. And the entire trajectory of Western civilization was preserved for 2 more centuries because 15,000 Roman legionaries stood firm while their cavalry fled and then slaughtered an exhausted enemy that should have won. Nobody remembers Immae, but you're reading this in a language derived from Latin, living under laws influenced by Roman legal principles, in a civilization shaped by Roman administrative concepts. Because 1,700 years ago, a blacksmith's son refused to let Rome die. Sometimes that's all it takes. 1 impossible victory, 1 afternoon of violence, 1 man who understands that losing isn't inevitable if you're willing to make the enemy defeat themselves. Aurelian saved civilization at Immae, and history forgot his name.